But thank you for being flexible throughout the day. There'll be a few more things, but eventually at the end of the day, we'll be closely around 5:15 or so we'll make the time up. But it is an indication of the discussions we've all had and the additions and moving around of the agenda. It's done purposefully. Even though we have agendas here at the Wilson Center, we kind of use them as rough frameworks often because these discussions are dynamic, and we want to leave it like that. So with that, I'm very happy that Mr. Sean Moon has been able to be with us today. We imposed upon his schedule as well. He is Chief Global Strategies, Office of Strategy, Policy and Plans for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. You've heard reference to DHS today, and so we're putting Sean on the spot to share with us DHS's perspectives and their plans and their work in the Arctic region. So Sean, thank you very much for allowing us to impose upon you. Mr. Sean Moon.
First off, decaf, so I won't speak too fast. Yeah, I love the imposition last night in rush hour traffic. It was Sean, are you willing to talk about the DHS strategy? Well, between the trucks and dodging the rest of the traffic on the DC Beltway, sure, whatever it takes, let's get off the phone. This morning there was discussion of Arctic strategies. The Commandant's response was, we have a strategy. Very true. We also have a national strategy for the Arctic region, which, contrary to what some people say, is very much in place. We've got the cited Coast Guard strategy, being updated and retitled as a strategic outlook. But I want to talk about something a little bit different. You know, along with all of the DoD and NOAA strategies, we are tending to look at Arctic strategic thinking inside pipelines. Okay. Shannon Jenkins, wherever you are, hiding over there, Shannon gave a list of Coast Guard missions up in the Arctic. Speaking from a DHS perspective, I want you to understand Customs and Border Protection has the lead for the borders and ports of entry, people and cargo. TSA has airports and aviation security. FEMA has disaster relief and support, as was demonstrated a few days ago and is still being demonstrated today. The Office of Cyber and Infrastructure Security, the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, just retitled from MPPD, has cyber and infrastructure. We've got ICE, Homeland Security Investigations, our Science and Technology Directorate. As General Key can attest, we've got a huge footprint, okay? What people tend to miss is they think of the Arctic and the Coast Guard, or they think of the Arctic and they think of the Coast Guard, and they think of a red hole. I guess I said one red hole. Or orange helicopters. What they don't think about is the thousands of miles of borders, land and maritime, the air domain, the whole 9 yards, that DHS's mission is to protect. Shannon also addressed the difference between national security and national defense. It's somewhat simplistic, but one way to think of that is defense operations are DoD, law enforcement is us. Okay? Whereas the Department of Defense is charged with military actions abroad, DHS works within the civilian sphere to protect the U.S. at, within, and outside its borders. Our goal is preparing, responding, and preventing domestic emergencies. Wherever we have to do that, we have thousands of folks overseas scanning cargo, conducting investigations. All of that's focused on the homeland. In recognition of the role of those 240,000 DHS personnel, the majority of which are sworn officers, in recognition of their roles, about 3 years ago, the department decided we were going to create an Arctic security strategy, which I have to be careful of the acronym, a strategy for Arctic security. Okay. We had the strategy ready to go. Yeah, I can tell who was thinking quickly on acronyms there. We had the strategy ready to go, and then we had an administration change, and it went into suspense. In June, Dr. Lillian Alessa, my deputy at the department, who is one of the nation's premier Arctic experts, decades of experience up there in the field, we were told, reopen the strategy, tighten it down, focus on security. Yes, there's an environmental piece because we have a stewardship mission, but ultimately we were told tighten it and focus on security. Okay? Lil, by the way, is one of the drivers of Arctic policy within the federal and international sphere these days. To inform our strategy, we have done multiple workshops called Quadrant-Enabled Delphis. That's where we bring experts together. We do a facilitated discussion set. It's a very complicated mechanism to get essentially the truth, quantifiable data out of experts. 80 to 100 people in a room at a time, finding out, ranking, prioritizing, getting valid data, defensible data. We've done a number of QEDs specific to the Arctic. By the way, if you want to know about QEDs, go look at the Journal of Homeland Security Affairs. Our article was published in September. There is an in-depth discussion of what we do. We're also currently engaged with the intelligence community. And we're assessing the activities that have been taking part in the gaps, the seams, the interstitial spaces that we don't look at normally because we don't have assets up there. Or we have minimal assets. Or we have CubeSats that look for EPIRBs but not anything else. Okay? We've also started to move assets, DHS personnel, into theater. How many people know that there are now CBP officers, Border Patrol specifically, inside the ACIAC? Really? 6 of you. Information is starting to flow. We've been doing the study and analysis. We actually can tell you, lat long and date time, when things have been happening up there. Anybody know the phrase phase 0? Okay. We've got data that says we're in phase 0 if we're not transitioning into phase 1. Okay. Recognizing all of that, that's why we're re-racking a harder, tighter strategy. Okay. The DHS Strategy for Arctic Security, got it right that time, will be the overriding department guidance. We've got the Coast Guard strategy. CBP is looking to develop a strategy. Blaine Sector is already taking a really hard look at it. S&T, etc. There'll be this overarching strategy that is the link between the national strategic thinking and the department, those 240,000 boots on the ground. The strategy emphasizes that the changing environments are adopting trajectories that require us to think and work differently. We just can't do business as usual. We have to change the way we think about integration across the social, ecological, technological systems in the context of security. And this is why I have this. We need to do more with less, which sounds like your standard cliche, but it's realistic. We aren't going to see much more budget. So we have to be smarter. We have to address redundant work. My excuse. There's a lot of redundancy, especially in the science and the R&D side of the house. Okay. One agency is doing something, another agency has retitled it as doing something very similar. We've got to find the way across that. And we have to shift our view of risk. We can't think of the Arctic in terms of per capita risk. We have to think of it in terms of risk to nation. Okay. Let me give you a concept of that. According to the Alaska State Troopers, if the narcotics that flow into Alaska were consumed internally to Alaska, there wouldn't be any survivors. Where's it going? Risk to nation. Also think if somebody penetrates our borders, they're domestic right there. They are as domestic for travel and transport as we are in the District of Columbia. How much security goes into getting onto an airplane at Dulles, other than the TSA stuff? Okay. We're doing some pre-screening, we are doing security, we do the inspections, but it's very different than the overseas travel. Shifting our thinking also means we cannot continue to think of the Arctic as the circle that's defined in the law, even though it's got that really cool tail. We have to take into account that the Arctic is connected globally and becoming more connected all the time. That's part of the problem. We have to think about the entirety of the state of Alaska. Illegal immigrants, drugs, nation-state actors, earthquakes don't stop at lines defined by law. It's a system. Now, I'm going to say that the Coast Guard is an important part of the strategy. You guys get the big red boats, all of that. But our emphasis is on a whole of government and whole of department approach. We're emphasizing that we have to serve all Americans. Just because you live in the Arctic, just because you live in Alaska, doesn't mean you're less of an American. You deserve every mission the department owes you. Period. Broadly speaking, our strategy seeks 4 goals. Foster and establish and maintain functional awareness of all Arctic domains and risk environments. And that risk environments is very specific. We have to know what's happening in order to operate. We're seeking to do our mission, secure the Arctic region borders and infrastructure, to provide the services we provide to the rest of America. We're seeking to promote the resilience and preparedness of the Arctic communities. Honestly, we need to reduce the need for central responses, which with the vast distances, etc., aren't necessarily going to be useful to the communities. And of course, the standard piece for DHS, facilitate and sustain commerce. As that grows, we have to be there. There was discussion, where'd Paul go? Over lunch, over the issue of the Deepwater port. You spoke about integration. You bet. For that port to operate, you're going to need CBP, you're going to need the Coast Guard, you're going to need HSI ICE, you're going to need the entirety of our service set, or it can't operate. If CBP is not there to clear cargo, the cargo is an illegal entry. Passengers, cargo, the whole plethora of what we do. We know, DHS knows, and we explicitly state in the current draft of the strategy, we can't do this alone. We not only have to coordinate internally, we have to coordinate externally. David Kennedy, wherever you're hiding, you mentioned that we're engaged with NOAA. We are. We consult with you routinely and others, the intelligence community, OPNAV, N51. We're working with the National Science Foundation so that they embed security into their fundamental research. We're working with Canada. The Department of National Defense helped us in the first version of the strategy. They are helping us to write the second version of the strategy so that we align completely with them, not just nationally, binationally. They're our partners. We have a lot of partners up there. So let me summarize. My top line message is we, the Arctic stakeholder communities, need to think differently and be ready to act differently. We need a seamless strategic ecosystem from nation to department to component to field level operational planning. And that's why behind the work, or that's what's behind the work that Dr. Alessa and I are leading with the active participation of a large working group across DHS and the interagency. Okay. And I'm sure you're going to have questions.
Thank you, Sean. So why don't we, I won't stand on the stage, but we'll only take 1 or 2 questions. Alice, why don't you start us off? Yep, we'll get we're getting a microphone. We want to make sure we pick it up. It's coming. Thank you.
Technology.
Okay. I love what you're saying. I had an experience about 8 years ago in the village of Point Hope that has stayed with me ever since. I watched the German cruise ship, I think it's called the Hamburg, the one that comes across northern Canada most summers and then goes around down the western side of Alaska. They dropped anchor probably a mile offshore of Point Hope. All the passengers donned identical red parkas. They got in identical Zodiacs. They came on shore at the old village site of Point Hope. Myself, and the village mayor in a truck watched them walk around the old village home sites, stuff their pockets with whatever they saw on the ground, all of which are precious antiquities, got back in the Zodiacs, and went back out to the ship. I remember telling Janet Napolitano about this. She was then secretary, so however many years ago it was. Obviously, the point is, how can you find a system of deputizing village officials on the 3,000-mile Bering Sea coastline of Alaska to be able to have some enforcement authority against people coming on shore for reasons that are not consistent with U.S. law?
Great question, complex question, and a complex answer. Part of the answer is we can't deputize. Okay, there's a lot involved in deputization, but that doesn't mean we can't partner with the local law enforcement. We do it all the time. The bigger question or challenge to that specific type of scenario is discovery. Okay, that is engaging with the local communities in a community-based observation system in order that they have a mechanism to report so that the appropriate authorities, whether local, state, or federal, can do something. That goes back to that whole awareness thing I spoke about a minute ago. If we don't know what's happening, we can't do anything. And I'm pretty sure you folks don't want us to hire another 30,000 DHS personnel in order to station them in Alaska. I'm honestly not sure I could get 30,000 personnel to go to Alaska because they seem to like the southwest border. But for us, things like the community-based observation networks that were developed are still under development under other auspices. Those are the key. Awareness, partnership, reporting. See something, say something, send something. Enable the community to work together.
How about one more question? I'll get it. We're good.
Thank you. Dan Lamoth, I'm with the Washington Post. I caught the phrase that caught my ear was the redundancies in the science and R&D side of the house. I imagine that's very much in the eyes of the beholder, especially at a time when there is a lot of concern about how the administration looks at science. Where do you see that going? And I guess if we could drill down a bit, what sort of examples might there be?
I'll give you an example off the top of my head. A few years ago, there was a proposed research project that was using bubbles in the water column to basically predict oil movement during a spill event. Sounded like a real cool piece of science unless you knew that it was actually proposed and performed in the mid-'70s under the oil spill, the International Oil Spill Conference. It's not just the grants. It's coordination of science, and that's why we're talking with NSF, to embed security and to really, truly work. There's going to be redundancy. Part of science is repeatability. That's actually a good thing. But what is actually necessary becomes the key question. Please. Row in the back. There.
So we did an assessment of data, diversity, volume, and velocity. How many months ago?
Capri 8.
8 months ago. And this was 148 data experts from across academia, the government, NGOs, et cetera. And what we found is that we have a lot of volume. We have fairly low diversity in those data, particularly for the Arctic. And we have variable velocity, which means that the data are not often available in the time space we need it. So that was a quantitative way of seeing which areas had too much depth. So it's going to be sea ice. It's going to be some of your meteorological research, your sea ice research. It's going to be a lot of research where you have research across the Arctic nations that have not been leveraged to essentially do a meta-analysis to say, all right, where are the gaps in here that we need to fill in? Rather, it's the tradition of simply doing what we know how to do, rather than have the basic science being driven by the needs we have across the spectrum of operations and applicability.
Let me just close with one last comment or observation. If you go to the Homeland Security Affairs Journal, you will see that part of the title of our article is not just quadrant-enabled Delphi. It's not just facilitation. It is creating operator-driven policy based on data. If we, and this is part of the reason Lil and I are leading the effort within DHS, if we don't create strategies that support, guide, help the boots on the ground, we fail. So my last thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Our next panel, we're going to move the schedule again a little bit, but we'll have a full panel, and we'll adjust the coffee break here in a moment. This panel is entitled Policy, Research, and Development Perspectives on America's Arctic. And you see the number of seats here. This will take depth and breadth of issues. Moderating this panel is Brian Rogers, the Chancellor Emeritus of the University of Alaska Fairbanks and the former Chairman of the Board of Governors of the University of the Arctic. So I invite Brian Rogers and his panel to the podium. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Mike. And while the panel's coming up, what we've heard so far is primarily from the security agencies. Now we want to hear from some folks with on-the-ground, long-term on-the-ground experience in Alaska, and then companies and entities with assets that can support national security in the Arctic. We'll hear from 6 people in all, and I'll do quick introductions of all of them now, and then we'll just work our way down. Mayor Bryce Ward, this is his second month on the job as the mayor of the Fairbanks North Star Borough. He's a 2-term mayor of the city of North Pole, Alaska, and was a general contractor before that. Larry Hinsman, Dr. Hinsman, is the Vice Chancellor for Research at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, an environmental engineer. He's Vice President of the International Arctic Science Committee and former member of the U.S. Polar Research Board. Dr. Bob McCoy is Director of the University of Alaska Fairbanks Geophysical Institute with a long career as a space scientist for the Navy, and he got his PhD at UC Boulder. Marcel Lettre, too, is Vice President for National Security for Government Affairs at Lockheed Martin and a former Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, has served under 4 different Secretaries of Defense. Dr. Holly Dockery is Senior Manager of Global Engineered Security Solutions at Sandia National Labs. Will give us some background and perspective from the national labs. She also worked for DHS as Senior Director of the Office of Policy. And finally, Bill Monet is the CEO of Acoma, Nana Corporation, and between all of these panelists, we'll have then a local government, the academy, national labs, and corporate perspectives on policy and R&D and how those assets can support the national security agenda. So with that, I'll turn to Bryce as our first panelist.
Yes, thank you to the Wilson Center and to Dr. Mike Sfraga for pulling together the Polar Initiative. It's an honor to be a part of this important discussion today. Alaska was accepted into the Union as the nation's 49th state in 1959, but Alaska's patriotism and devotion to serving our country predated statehood by decades. Alaska began to play a more significant role in 1942 with the construction of the Alcan Highway, connecting the continental United States with Alaska. This important road was constructed by the Army Corps of Engineers and was constructed in only 8 months. As was then, Alaska continues to be the tip of the spear for American influence and authority in the Arctic and Asia, which has allowed and continues to allow for the United States to project its influence over the Northern Hemisphere. Alaska, with its strategic importance to the country and deep patriotic ties, yearns to strengthen our partnership with the military and support the mission of our nation's defense. We are not uninhabited. Alaska, Fairbanks, and the Arctic are full of people who are devoted to their community, committed to helping each other, supporting our military, engaged in the needs of our nation, and prepared for growth. We take our job seriously, and with the announcement of the placement of 2 F-35 squadrons at Eielson Air Force Base, the community, with a grant provided by the Department of Defense Office of Economic Adjustment, have prepared a regional growth plan to ensure we are going to meet the needs of our incoming airmen and their families. The Borough regularly schedules meetings with our base commanders for the civilian military meeting, where we discuss challenges and opportunities for collaboration between the installation and the community. We also hold a bi-monthly Tiger Team meeting to gather with community leaders to identify challenges and barriers to partnership with the military so we can be stronger together. We also have a world-class university, America's Arctic University to be specific, and are working on partnership with our institution and the military to better serve the needs of our country and the world. The Joint Pacific-Alaska Range Complex is another example of the public and private partnership Alaska has with the nation's military. We are military connected. In my hometown of Fairbanks, Alaska, nestled in the Golden Heart of Alaska, just below the Arctic Circle, we are home to America's farthest north city with access by road, rail, air, and trail. We are also home to Eielson Air Force Base and Fort Wainwright Army Post. Uniform military and their dependents comprise almost 20% of the borough's total population, and an even greater percentage of our economy. You would be hard-pressed to find someone that does not have a family member or a friend that is connected to the military in some form or fashion. We are also deeply patriotic. North Pole, Alaska, located between Fort Wainwright and Eielson Air Force Base, is the fastest growing district within the borough and is slated to continue that trend in the future. The North Pole High School mascot is the Patriot, and many of our residents are veterans. The Fairbanks North Star Borough boasts the highest percentage of veterans in the state of Alaska at 11%. We also pride ourselves in making our community one that welcomes our soldiers and their families with open arms. Jim and Rosemary Messer, a Fairbanks couple, started this tradition by welcoming military families into their home over 50 years ago. A tradition that still holds strong for families throughout our community, and one that we now recognize through events such as the Military Appreciation Banquet and many other events we hold each year. These recognize members of our military and community that exude this characteristic. We are here. Being born and raised in the interior has written the code of the Arctic in my DNA. Maybe it's the pioneering spirit needed to use an outhouse at 40 below, or maybe it's the need to slow down and realize that we all have a part in making our community and our world a better place. Whatever it may be, I'm continually impressed with the potential and possibilities available to those who are willing to try, push the limits to seek new horizons, and push to seek limits to new horizons. Alaska is the horizon to America's Arctic. The Fairbanks North Star Borough is the gateway to America's Arctic, and we stand ready to collaborate with the nation to be better. We stand, as a nation, on the precipice of a new age of innovation and collaboration, one the world has yet seen. The Arctic is a catalyst, and one that we must use to propel us into the world of collaboration and partnership. This requires us to begin to share information and technology with ourselves in ways that we have not before. Alaska, America's Arctic, provides the interface for this type of collaboration and the test bed for this type of development. There is an unwritten rule of the Arctic: one must always travel with a partner. As we step through the gateway to America's Arctic, to America's future, it requires partners, collaboration, and a desire to do things better. We are here and we are ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Ward. And before I turn to Larry, I just wanted to make a note. Larry is known for all of 3 days that he was going to be on this panel. We had significant adjustments following the earthquake as we lost panelists and other speakers over the course of the day, and I really appreciate, Larry, your willingness to step in and provide your perspective.
Sure, thanks. I'm going to speak from up here if it's okay, because I want to use some slides.
Sure.
I'll speak to the slides. So, like most academics, I don't need 3 days to prepare. So I just want to give a little bit of background on climate really quickly, and then I want to talk about some of the aspects that are going to affect security. So I want to start out with this slide, and that this is the slide of the data from the Vostok borehole in Antarctica. So the middle plot, the middle line, oops, sorry, is there, there we go. So the middle line, the red line, is the temperature, and it shows how it's varied over the last 500,000 years. And the line above it, the blue line, is the CO2 curve, and the line below it is the methane curve. And the important thing here is that about every 100,000 years or so, we have a real rapid increase. Or for the last 500,000 years, I guess I'll start with this. For the last 500,000 years, most of the time, we've been wrapped up in an ice age. So very, very seldom do we get as warm as we are today. So this weather that we're having today, this climate that we're having today is unusual. About every 100,000 years, we warm up rapidly, and for a very brief period, then we cool off for another 100,000 years, and we warm up. And what's driving that, obviously, is the solar cycles. And I guess the important thing I want to show here is that the methane and the CO2 are really closely aligned with that. And that's really important for what's going on today. So the solar cycles are driving this, Milankovitch cycles. Everybody knows this. We have three cycles. We have the eccentricity, the obliquity, and the equinoxes, the precession of the equinoxes. And these are all simple sine curves that vary on various scales. So the eccentricity is on 100,000 years, obliquity 41,000. The precession of the equinoxes 19 and 23,000. And these are all simple sine curves that the nice thing about sine curves is they're additive. And so we can really predict very, very well what the radiation at the top of the atmosphere has been for the last million years. And it varies it goes from, this curve, this is for Fairbanks, so 64 degrees north. So it goes from about 400 watts per meter squared to about 500 watts per meter squared. So it varies at the top of the atmosphere by about 100 watts. And so that's, so this is about a 100-watt light bulb. And you can see that, that's about 25% change from peak to minimum. And so you can easily understand how that could have such a big impact. And now when we lay this over the peaks of the insolation, the peak of the radiation at the top of the atmosphere to the changes in temperature for the last 500,000 years, we can see that those peaks in radiation just nail the peaks in the temperature. So they're obviously driving it. And here's the really important part. It's obviously the insulation, the radiation is obviously driving it, except when it doesn't. And so you see these peaks here in the radiation, and we're not getting the peaks in we're not coming out of the ice age. We're still locked up in an ice age. And so the key here is that it doesn't just take the radiation, it also takes the methane and the CO2. You have to get those feedbacks. You have to get that methane and that CO2 feedback to pull us out of an ice age. And that's really, really critical as far as where we are right now. And so the important thing I want to make about this plot here is that essentially this is, for the last 500,000 years, it varies, between the CO2 and methane. The CO2 varies between 180 and 280 parts per million. But this is where we are right now, over 400 parts per million CO2. We're just off the charts in CO2 and methane. And so my point in showing you all this background is that basically there's one direction we're going. We're warming, and there's no mechanism to stop it. So the climate is changing, the climate is warming, and that's essentially the direction where we're going. So for the most part, we know the basic variables, what's going to happen. We know the air temperature is going to get warmer. We know sea ice is going to continue to degrade. We know permafrost is going to thaw. We know the glaciers are going to melt. We know the important things that are going to happen. But what we need from a security perspective and from a climate perspective and from a community planning perspective, we need to know those second order variables. We need to know, I guess I'll go through this real quickly. We know sea ice is degrading. That's going to continue to happen. We know this is really important. This is the Bering Sea ice this last year. And look at this. This is just off the charts here too. We reached a minimum, and a super extensive minimum that we've never seen before for the Bering Sea ice. And I guess I want to show this too. As far as this is the change in temperatures that we've witnessed and that we're projecting to see in Alaska. And the important thing here is that for the middle of the road projection, we can see that by the end of this century, 2099, we expect all of Alaska to be above freezing, and that's a huge, huge difference for us. And that the rest of the world is warming, but Alaska and Canada are going from a place of being frozen to a place of being thawed. And so that crossing that phase barrier is huge. It's a huge difference between being frozen, being thawed, as opposed to the similar warming going on in more temperate regions. You may not witness it as much, but it's a dramatic change for us. It's structural impacts to us. So there's going to be tremendous changes, and the consequences of that are huge as far as what to agriculture, to infrastructure, and other characteristics. And I think from a security perspective, the important thing is what's that going to do to environmental refugees. So the northern regions are going to be becoming more habitable. The more temperate regions are becoming less habitable. And so on the scale of 100 years, 200 years, That's something we need to think about. What are the, what's going to be driving migration of people, and how do we anticipate that and minimize conflicts? Finally, what I want to show also is this is the plot. This is from the most recent National Climate Assessment, and it shows the amount of erosion that's occurring along our north coast. And in some places, it's tremendous. It shows on the order of varying from 15 to 61 feet per year. In some places, it's minimal, just -6 to -1 foot, but it's eroding the whole north coast. And so the consequence of that is that, we have a lot of villages. We have 23 villages in Alaska that need to be moved, need to be relocated. Not all of them are along the coast, obviously, but so the issue is, how do we identify places that are secure, that are stable, so that we can move a village, move a community, and we don't just move it into a place where they're going to have similar problems in another 50 or 100 years. And the other thing, I guess, is one thing is I think what we really need to do from a security perspective is that we really need to understand these second-order variables better. So permafrost temperatures is one of them. So for building in cold regions, we're going to be building on permafrost for the next couple hundred years. It takes a long time for permafrost to degrade. What we should have done when we built the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, we should have anticipated the climate was warming and designed the pipeline for the future conditions. Instead, we used the Engineering Atlas of Alaska and used the data from the previous 30 years instead of for the next 30 years. So our piling lengths on our pipeline and a lot of the infrastructure are too short. The length of the piling is defined by the ad-freeze strength of the soil. As the soil warms, that ad-freeze strength decreases, and the pilings have to be longer. We can retrofit it. We can do a lot of work to make it work, but it would have been so much better, and we need to do that at this point. We have to look forward and use this future design, not past conditions. Let's see. Oh, it's not in here. I just put a slide in, but I guess I dropped it. The one thing that I want to talk about really briefly is recently there was an Arctic Science, the second Arctic Science Ministerial was held in Berlin in late October. And that had, there was the 8 Arctic nations, 15 other nations, the European Union, and 6 indigenous organizations all agreed to collaborate on and contribute to advancing Arctic science and improving our understanding of the Arctic dynamics and helping our world better prepare. One of the things that we very much need, probably the most important thing that we need, is observations. And these 26 governments essentially agreed to contribute to help us improve our observing network and build the communities, build the capabilities that we need to make good decisions. So, very briefly, I guess some of those important second-order parameters that I would like to see better data, better understanding, better capability include wind loads, snow distribution, agricultural potential, and soil-bearing capacity. And with that, I will thank you and end.
Thank you, Larry. I'll turn now to Bob McCoy, Director of the UAF Geophysical Institute.
So this afternoon, I'd like to talk about the Arctic and Alaska in terms of geophysics, give a geophysics and a university perspective. The Geophysical Institute was created by Congress at the end of World War II because of effects of the aurora on HF communication. Turns out, still lots of effects of the aurora on HF communication. The airlines fly 15,000 flights over the Arctic a year, and when there's high solar activity, they have to divert south, so it's still a major problem. But I'm going to talk about geophysics. To do our research, we have to use a number of major facilities that are funded by federal agencies, and some of these can be used for national defense. And so to frame my discussions, I want to mention 4 priorities that I heard General O'Shaughnessy from Northcom give at an Arctic Maritime Symposium a couple of months ago. He said for the Arctic and for Alaska, his priorities was presence, infrastructure, Arctic communication, and domain awareness. So as I'm talking about geophysics in Alaska, you'll see some of this. So to us, this is a laboratory. Alaska and the Arctic, we do as you've already heard, earthquakes and volcanoes, they don't understand national boundaries. We do a lot of research into Russia and into China and Canada. But this is our laboratory. We operate all over Alaska, and we have a lot of phenomena that's really unique in in Alaska. First of which is the aurora. 2 nights ago I saw the aurora. We're approaching solar minimum. There's an 11-year cycle, but if it's clear and if it's not light, which it's light all summer long, you can see the aurora. It's pretty exciting. Aurora affects communication, affects navigation, GPS navigation. And Lloyd's of London has estimated for a large coronal mass ejection like back in 1859, there could be $2.5 trillion of damage. I've heard the NOAA administrator say the biggest disaster this nation may face will be a space weather disaster. So space weather is something we see on a daily basis. Volcanoes. In Alaska, we have 54 active volcanoes. There's an eruption every 3 months. Last year, Boguslav erupted 64 times, sent ash up 30,000 feet. 80% of the air traffic from Asia comes right through this corridor, and there's 70 passengers a day flying right through this area that's affected by all these active volcanoes. Permafrost. 90% of the state is permafrost. This is a picture in Bethel, but you can imagine runways on land like this. Once you build on permafrost, it starts to change. And as Larry Hinsman just said, the models show the next 20 years, next 50 years in Alaska, all the models are going to be wrong. We're going to need new models and new levels of understanding of permafrost, because it's all going to be changing. So in the area of persistence infrastructure, this is important. Earthquakes. This is a photograph of the earthquake Friday morning. In Alaska, we typically have 43,000 earthquakes a year. And there's a magnitude 7. I thought every 2 years. Now I've got to say every 1 year there's a magnitude 7. We monitor these earthquakes. There's a magnitude 6 about 3 times a year in Alaska. It's very active seismically. This is another photograph of the ice exercise. A lot of in the winter shore-fast sea ice. Some of our faculty went and helped with the ice exercise this past winter. It was great. They picked a site. They built runways. They sat on the ice. One of my professors sat there, Andy Mahoney, sat there for 6 weeks eating MREs. When the submarine finally came, I said, "Did they bring you in and give you a nice meal?" And he says, "They brought me in and gave me a cup of coffee." So, but it was such a success. The Navy is now doing a mini ICEX next year and a full ICEX the year after. So this is a big deal. Glaciers. We have 100,000 glaciers in Alaska. We monitor them with satellite, airborne, manned aircraft and unmanned aircraft, and very strange weather. This is a photograph of the solstice from my building. Solstice at about 2 more weeks. The sun's pretty low, not much warmth. The air is very stable. What you see in the foreground there is ice fog. Weather forecasts in Alaska are terrible because a lot of the forecasts are based on satellite data. There hasn't been a lot of good ground-based data in Alaska, and so a lot of needs for improved forecast of Arctic weather. So this is where we live. This is where we operate. So I want to talk about some of the facilities that we have in the Geophysical Institute. We man the Alaska Volcano Observatory funded by USGS. These are 24/7. We monitor those earthquakes and provide ash forecast. The Earthquake Center, the Alaska Earthquake Center is in my institute. The state seismologist is part of the Geophysical Institute, and he was pretty busy on Friday monitoring all these earthquakes. You've heard from Nettie LaBelle-Hammer a couple times today. She runs the Alaska Satellite Facility, which downlinks for NASA 40% of their polar orbiting satellite data. She has several other dishes that she uses in conjunction with GeoNorth for an Arctic Geodata Cooperative and Lockheed to provide data, domain awareness data to NGA, and also her CAFE, the CubeSat Antenna Farm experiment, which she was able to contact the CubeSat that was just launched by for the USGS. We have a rocket range 35 miles outside of town. We have 5 rails. We launch rockets into the Aurora. It's the only university-owned rocket range in the world, the largest land-based, 5,000 acres. We launch sounding rockets up to the Brooks Range or all the way out into the Arctic Ocean to study the Aurora. In March, we'll be celebrating 50 years of launching sounding rockets to study the upper atmosphere in the Aurora. And hopefully in a year or so, we'll be launching missile defense rockets to test the LRDR being built by Lockheed in Clear. We fly a lot of unmanned aircraft. This is a Sea Hunter. These are Sentry. We got surplus. We have 200 aircraft. We fly all over the world. We're an FAA test range. We're one of the most active unmanned aircraft groups in the country. We do quite a bit of flying. We used to be a DoD high-performance computing center. We're not anymore, but we have quite a bit of capability to support geophysical research. The second to last bullet is the Wilson Alaska Technical Center. Those guys measure infrasound, and they're listening for nukes in the atmosphere. Because of their activity, it's taken a couple of years, but as of a few weeks ago, these guys became our newest UARC, the University Affiliated Research Center for the Department of Defense. We're number 17. Our title is Geophysical Detection of Nuclear Proliferation. And this is a big deal. We're just in the early stages of getting connected to the Department of Defense through as a UARC. And finally, on the bottom right panel, HAARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. HAARP was transferred to the GI in 2015, and we've had it open. We just completed a campaign there on Saturday. We've had 5 campaigns. We're using it for research with the Air Force, the Navy, National Science Foundation, and Department of Energy. This is HAARP, is what it looks like. It's the biggest HF. I said we were created for HF because of HF issues. This is the biggest HF transmitter, the biggest ham radio in the world. It was designed to study the effects of high-altitude nuclear events in the upper atmosphere and also for submarine communication. One of the things we can do with HAARP, if we put a small receiver array at Delta Junction, is turn it into an over-the-horizon radar to help with maritime domain awareness. This is a small receiver array, but also that's the same receiver array could, if we beam HAARP energy in different directions, we can form a dome of over-the-horizon radar around Alaska. This is something we're discussing a way forward. This is a place in Alaska, Licktock Point, which is way up north on the Arctic Ocean. But for a lot of Alaskans, will be impressed by the fact that there's a road you can drive to this place. A lot of places like Ukqiavik, you can't. I know NOAA, NASA, and a lot of people in flying unmanned aircraft there. We're working with Sandia to explore the concept to build a research facility, a high Arctic research lab, to fly unmanned aircraft all across the Arctic. We can also, it's on the Arctic Ocean, we can launch underwater vehicles under the ice and do quite a bit of work in this area. We've been talking with DOD and DOE about an Arctic research laboratory in Fairbanks in conjunction with a high-altitude Arctic laboratory at Licktock Point. And in a summary of all the aerospace facilities in Alaska, I've talked about unmanned aircraft, rocket ranges, downlinking satellite data, a new facility at Licktock Point, HAARP. I'd also like to mention the Alaska Aerospace Corporation and the Pacific Spaceport Complex Alaska in Kodiak Island. Right now they're launching THAADs with Missile Defense. Missile Defense is launching THAADs there at their spaceport, but they also launch satellites into polar orbit. This is a great facility. It's a nice backup to Vandenberg, but it also has the potential to become the center for low-cost launch to orbit. Lots of low-cost rocket providers are coming to Alaska Aerospace Corporation to develop and fly and test their equipment. So Alaska could be the low-cost center for launch to polar orbit. A lot of facilities and a lot of things you've heard General O'Shaughnessy talk about. We have capability that can address them. And finally, my last slide, and echoing what Mayor Ward said, we're there. We operate all over Alaska. We've been there a long time. It's our laboratory. We're prepared to help the Department of Defense and the Coast Guard. We have many times in the past. And as you up your game in the Arctic, we stand by to assist and to work with you. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Bob. And moving now from the academic to the corporate assets in Alaska, let me introduce Marcel Lettre from Lockheed Martin Corporation.
Great, thanks, Brian. So yes, I'll provide a little bit of a industry perspective and kind of take us back to some of the security aspects that I think are important to thinking through the Arctic challenges, certainly from the perspective of where I sit now as an executive with Lockheed, as well as, I should mention, the rest of the Lockheed crew who's here, Dan Schaefer and Gabby and Rick and others, who have really helped to kind of catalyze some of the discussions today. So thank you guys from the Lockheed side for pulling me in. But also in both the hat that I wear at Lockheed, but also in my previous hats with 20 years or so of congressional and Pentagon time, finishing up with a couple of years in the Pentagon lastly as the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. And I want to basically hit 3 areas: strategy, capabilities, and partners. So first on strategy, and again, from both my current hat as an industry guy and my previous hat as a Pentagon official, I'll repeat a little bit of some of the themes that have been touched on by uniformed and military Pentagon leaders over the course of these conversations today, but stressing the importance of the thinking currently underway at the Pentagon around the National Defense Strategy. And if you haven't read the unclassified 20-page or so précis of it that came out earlier this year, it is it's worth another look and thinking about it in the context of these conversations as well. When I was at the Pentagon over the last few years, I can attest to the conversation over the last 4 or 5 years being similar to what it is now and the themes that are enshrined in the National Security Strategy. A recognition that it was time, based on a perception of the threats and an analysis of the threats, to shift some of our weight of emphasis from the counterterrorism and counterinsurgency fights that we had been fighting since 2001 to thinking anew about some of the other challenges that we face globally. And so as this document and a lot of the conversation at the Pentagon shows, we do now think pretty hard about the nature of the great power competition that we face and the contested environments that near-peer competitors will be presenting to us in a way that we haven't had to experience in the non-contested permissive environments we were able to fight in the CT and COIN operations of the last 15, 16 years. And so how do we then reposture ourselves against that near-peer competitor threat generally when we also see it coupled with a pattern of behavior that is more aggressive in certain regions? And I would add the Arctic as one of those, but we see it in the South China Seas as well in the China context. In addition, the National Defense Strategy calls out the rapid pace of technology change, and both these dimensions, the tech change and the reemergence of great power competition, puts at risk the military's overmatch capability that we've had, sort of the unmatched ability to prevail against adversaries around the world that we have enjoyed for decades through our advantages from stealth, precision strike, global command and control, and communications, and so forth. As that advantage has begun to erode, it has really pushed the Pentagon to think anew about how we can asymmetrically regain that advantage over near-peer competitors. And so that has then pushed the thinking of the Pentagon's planners and strategists into a series of new capability developments across cyber, space, autonomy, artificial intelligence, hypersonics and counter-hypersonics, integrated air and missile defense, integrated air and space and multi-domain operations, and these kinds of concepts and capabilities. So as we think about applying this then to the threats, challenges, and potentially opportunities we see in the Arctic context, I would submit that we first need to make sure we understand how the military is thinking about these challenges under this National Defense Strategy construct, number one. Number two, thinking about strategies and concepts of operations and doctrinal changes that can be made to more creatively address the contested environments that we face. And then number three, thinking about how to build capability, recognizing that rapid pace of change, that creative adversary or competitor that is looking to apply asymmetry against us, and build capability on a timeline and in methodologies that allow us to more rapidly pursue advantage again. So that gets us to capability. And here I would say we should continue to make sure we understand where the military is headed with its investments, and just in a month or two we'll start to get a sense of what the 2020 proposed budget will look like, which Deputy Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan has indicated his desire to make it kind of a masterpiece of implementation of the National Defense Strategy. So we'll have to look at that budget and the 5-year projections it puts forward to see what kind of investments that are relevant to the National Defense Strategy are being pursued, and to what extent those apply in the Arctic context. I think from Lockheed's perspective, we're eager to take capability that we are supporting and continue the conversation about how that can be relevant to addressing a range of problem sets that apply in the Arctic context. So as the F-35 deploys and the 2 squadrons of 24 aircraft each come into place in the 2020 and beyond timeframe, what are the implications and opportunities for that deployment that can service national security interests, but also some of the other interests that we've been talking about this morning? As the nation builds out the long-range discriminating radar and CLEAR, obviously its first mission set, first and foremost, is to significantly enhance our ground-based mid-course defense in the missile defense context. But it also has secondary mission sets for the Air Force around space situational awareness. And to what extent can we look at tertiary mission opportunities with regard to the LRDR, such as supporting weather and transportation and other more localized situational awareness needs? It's a conversation we should have about what capability can be brought to bear there. North Warning System and sensor, the spectrum efficient national surveillance radar, are conversations that are underway about how to modernize and ensure those capabilities are, the capabilities that those systems represent are sufficient to the needs of the next couple of decades. And how can we ensure that all of the stakeholders who are present in the Arctic conversation can have that dialogue about how to put forward our best foot on those capability development areas. The GeoNorth was mentioned as kind of a big data analytic and image processing capability that's been, I think, a neat step forward in leveraging in an unclassified way intelligence community agencies like the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and industry partners to be able to put forward an interesting approach to modernizing and ensuring we have the best data sets and image processing capabilities in place for both national security and non-national security needs. And then I guess I just briefly mention energy, which is something that Lockheed does too. Lithium-ion storage, microgrid integration and support are also things that I think private sector entities can bring to bear to help with this conversation. So I've talked a little bit about strategy and capabilities. I guess the last point I'd make around partnerships is more thematic in nature. Whether it's pursuing all domain awareness or posture and presence and capabilities for seasonal operations in search and rescue or what have you, I think one theme we need to be keeping in mind is how do we fully purpose, how do we fully utilize capabilities that are already in place or being put in place in the years ahead. The LRDR example is one I think that is interesting. It's a good conversation to have about leveraging this capability for potentially multiple mission sets. Secondly, I guess I would say that some of the concepts that certainly Senator Murkowski has mentioned around living laboratory initiatives for collaboration, for prototyping, these are opportunities to rapidly innovate and purpose test capabilities that can be put in place on the timelines that we need them to be built out for national security purposes. If you kind of get back to the National Defense Strategy, one of the pushes that Secretary Mattis has insisted upon is how do we move faster, given the technology timelines that we're now dealing with. And I think that living laboratory approach can be a very important contributor there. And then finally, I guess I would say the true importance of a multi-stakeholder dialogue and for early industry partner participation in that dialogue. I think this conference is a great example of how when you bring the various interested stakeholders together, the connective tissue that gets built up, the richness of the dialogue that gets built up, can be a pretty powerful thing. It helps create a community of interest that's more relevant, more focused, and identifies more opportunity for kind of the win-win solutions that we need to bring to bear in a resource-constrained environment. And so I would just continue to urge that we look for that broadest possible participation of stakeholders in that community conversation around our approach to the Arctic. So I'll pause there, Brian, and look forward to questions.
Thank you, Marcel. I'll turn now to Dr. Dockery for a national lab perspective.
And of course we have geographs. What would you expect? Good afternoon, and thank you very much to the Wilson Center for hosting this event and for allowing us to be part of the event. I think I beat out Larry because I found out yesterday morning I was going to do this when Dave White said, I've got the flu and I can't be there. So, so national labs move even faster than academics, I guess. Ooh. I did want to also say that there are 3 people in the audience who are also from Sandia Labs who have a lot more experience in the Arctic than I do. One of them is Lori Parrott. She runs our efforts within the laboratory on research and development around the Arctic. Mark Ivey, don't know where Mark Ivey is, there he is, and he sits up at Elictoc Point most of the time. It's really strange to see him outside of a bunny suit. So, and Peter Davies, who is a retired director from Sandia and currently a Wilson Fellow, but once a Sandian, always a Sandian, right, Peter? So, what I want to talk about is I want to let you know a little bit about what Sandia does that might make us relevant to this space, because that might not be clear, and also talk about a couple of initiatives that we think could be helpful and sort of point to some of the things that Larry talked about and Bob talked about. Sandia National Labs is a Department of Energy National Nuclear Security Administration operated laboratory. We are a resource to all of government. We have a large portfolio that includes the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, and practically any other government agency that you can imagine, including the intelligence community. We are the largest of the federally funded research and development centers that exist within the United States, and we really address the major national security challenges involving at the forefront or beyond the forefront of technology solutions and technology threats. We leverage our about $3.2 billion, oops, I guess I have to operate, don't I? Sorry. Well, I turned it on.
Turn it around.
Well, okay. Thank you. Duh. Okay. Here we go.
Good collaboration.
Great. See, collaboration in action. So we leverage about $3.2 billion worth of U.S. government investments and about 13,000 experts, many of whom are engineers. So in the Hug Your Engineer light, we're up trying to solve the national security challenges. Most of what you probably know us for, if you know us at all, is for our work in nuclear weapons. We have the charge for safety, security, and effectiveness of the nuclear deterrent. But we also do a lot of work, as I said, for the DoD, the IC, and DHS across cyber, across artificial intelligence, robotics, large-scale data analytics and network analysis, advanced energy, infrastructure resilience. We're in WMD, ChemBio. We're across the board looking at those key challenges to national security. So we feel like not only because of our broad remit to address the national security problems, and clearly the Arctic is a major emerging national security challenge that requires a focused attempt to understand the science and technology. We also, because of the nature of the work we do, are a systems laboratory. We think about large-scale systems. We don't think about parts and pieces, but how all of the pieces fit together. And so understanding the interdependencies, the major drivers, and how to prioritize this effort is a large part of what we think we bring to the game, perhaps in addition to our other partners. Sandia has been present in the Arctic for a little over 20 years. We started up doing research and development up in Elictoc, where we supported the Department of Energy's atmospheric radiation detection program, so part of the non-proliferation program. The facilities that we have in Elictoc and in Ukvik are very much part of our a part of where we we want to take forward the work that Sandia does in collaboration with others to accomplish the goals of Arctic security. In ELECTOC in particular, as Bob pointed out, we are partnering with the University of Alaska Fairbanks and with the Wilson Center to operate a facility that performs R&D across a wide range of activities, and we've looked at developing microgrids for local communities and for the military. We have flown SAR flights over the ice to look at ice thicknesses and crevasses. We've operated autonomous UASs out into the restricted airspace that extends 700 miles toward the North Pole from ELECTOC Point. And we have looked at a number of other sorts of new sensor technologies, including the RF and infrasound. We are right now supporting the U.S. Coast Guard. As I speak today, we have a group at Sandia to look at developing a test series for emergency beacons to communicate with the CubeSats that were just launched. And so in the spring, I guess we'll be doing a test, and they will understand how well those emergency beacons will operate, and we'll be there to help support them. One of the big initiatives that we would like to talk about is the High Arctic Research Center. Bob talked about this briefly. We'd like to help decision makers understand the Arctic environment more completely. This is a very harsh environment. It has very atypical conditions, and it has many characteristics of a denied territory. So in collaboration with a number of partners, including the University of Alaska Fairbanks, the Wilson Center, and others, we've presented a concept or developed a concept to take advantage of our existing assets and to create a high Arctic research support center that would allow cooperative research across a number of entities. We see it as a potential part of a constellation of research facilities that would connect with the existing research facilities, perhaps in Alaska already, with Canada, with Greenland, with other nations. It has some very specific, as was pointed out again, it has a road, it has the restricted airspace access, and it is immediately adjacent to, both sites are adjacent to the Air Force dew line facilities. So we have cooperative opportunities with the Air Force on some of the efforts that they have ongoing. Lori, do you have anything else you'd like to add to the High Arctic Research Center? No, you covered it. Okay.
Arctic fiber is there. There's new Arctic fiber that's been laid to ELECTOC.
Thank you. So another initiative that we are also exploring has to do with the Partnership for Responsible Planning of Arctic Resilience and Development, prepared. So it's a infrastructure analysis approach to help with mission assurance and with community resilience, leveraging the tools and the understanding of critical infrastructure, of operations, and of interdependencies that we built for the Department of Homeland Security back post 9/11. It was part of the original NESAC. And also all of the expertise that we've developed in natural disasters characterization and in understanding the fragility of infrastructures. We have put together through our internal funding, we've put together a tool that will allow us to take different scenarios, whether it's earthquakes, coastal erosion, permafrost melt, any other effect that might impact the ability of the infrastructure to operate, and combine those in ways to understand how resilient is the infrastructure. how likely is the infrastructure to continue to operate or to be operable in changing conditions. And if we look at the network modeling that you can perform in addition to this, and also assess impacts, perform prioritization and optimization studies, we'll have the ability to inform communities, to inform the military, to inform the state on what are their options, how might they move forward in the most resource compatible way. So at the end of the day, we would look at potentially food and energy security, at reliable transportation, at military mission assurance, at any particular view on the problem that the sponsor wants to take. So this is an area in which we believe there is a lot of potential to help inform decision makers, to help them both increase robustness and address fragilities, and to focus on ways to allocate resources so that we address the most significant risks. At the end of the day, we want to make informed decisions that can help anticipate the future as well as address the current situation. So we'd like to continue to have the dialogue, particularly on the High Arctic Research Center and on the prepared model, and look forward to ways in helping make sure, as Church would have said, we can have a persistent path toward addressing our problems in a very resource-constrained environment. Thank you.
Like our last speaker, our final speaker has only known for 2 days that he was going to be here today. Wayne Westlake, the president of NANA Corporation, was scheduled to be here, but unfortunately his headquarters building in Anchorage took a little damage on Friday, and he needed to be there. So I really appreciate Bill Monet from Acoma stepping in on short notice to talk from a perspective of a company whose owners have been in the Arctic for millennia.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Mike. Great conference. Yes, this was short notice. I was on a conference call with Mr. Wayne Westlake and the team in Anchorage when the earthquake hit. And, you can imagine what the reaction was on the phone and listening to it on the phone. You can't underestimate the psychological effect of an earthquake, especially when you're in a tall building and a large earthquake. Any of you who have experienced that is something you will absolutely never forget. What is NANA? So NANA is a region, it's a company, and it's a people. So as a region, NANA is about the size of Indiana, so it's not small. If you looked at it on the map, it's going to look kind of small relative to Alaska. But Alaska is extraordinarily big. So about the size of Indiana in the northwest side of Alaska. It is north of the Bering Straits, bordered on the Chukchi Sea, and it's got 11 villages. You've heard people talk about Kotzebue today several times, and Kotzebue is the largest village within the NANA region, and it actually has an airstrip, about 7,000 feet, can take some big aircraft, and it's actually also got a hotel. So it's, and I've been there a lot. The other villages don't, and I've been there a lot. There's a big difference. So infrastructure, we talked about that quite a bit. That is got to be a major theme in anything that's discussed in Alaska. One of the significant assets of NANA in the NANA region is the Red Dog Mine. It is the largest zinc mine on the planet. They not only mine the ore and run the operations with Native Alaskans from the NANA region, but also ship that ore overland, about 50 miles, to the barges that are then set to sea for transport. So we're talking about 500,000 tons. And they've been doing this for now 20 years, working with the EPA, working with industry, and have done that successfully without incident. My primary point here is they know how to operate in one of the harshest environments on the planet. And they run that mine 365 days a year. So they know how to operate. And I've been up there. I know many of you also have. It's a very tough environment. The other asset that NANA has is Akima. And Akima is a federal arm, a business arm of NANA. And we do about $1.2 billion of business with our federal partners and the DOD and throughout all the agencies, throughout the lower 48 and throughout the world. We do large IT jobs. We do about $600 million in IT. We do base ops, large base ops operations. We do aviation, system engineering and integration. We do work for the Coast Guard, for the Navy. We have a very strong maritime capability. And we also do work with DHS and detention management, et cetera. We're actually partnered with Lockheed Martin. We do a tremendous amount of work with Sandia Labs. So we have a sophisticated federal contracting business, and as was discussed by many of the presenters, it's not easy to get things done in Washington, D.C., but you have a 1-2 punch with NANA. You've got a federal contracting arm that's based here in Washington, D.C., but then you also have the Inupiat owners and operators that know how to operate in Alaska and are in Alaska. There's a strong labor force there. So you've got the ability to contract, to partner, to do things, and get things done in Alaska, in the Arctic. By the way, the Red Dog Mine is, all of this is north of the Arctic Circle. The Red Dog Mine is 100 miles north of the Arctic Circle. So it's rough environment. So as you think about executing strategies and as you think about doing things in whether it be military operations, military readiness, communications, any of the base ops, any of the infrastructure things that need to be done in Alaska, you have a willing partner in NANA. These people have a vested interest, obviously. They have a vested interest in the outcomes and being a participant. And they want to see and want to not just observe from the sidelines, they want to be in the game. When I talk about, and we talk to our shareholders, they have a comment, and they talk about living in two worlds in one spirit. And it's a profound comment because they really want to advance in the modern world while they preserve this 10,000-year-old culture. And so be sure to understand that you do have a willing participant in modernity. They want to advance. They want to develop the Arctic. And they want to do it responsibly, and they want to do it with partnership. And so as we look at, a lot of these things just need money, okay? I mean, it really does come down to, and the Admiral talked about some of the very practical things, and he brought up infrastructure. You cannot do these things without the infrastructure. It just isn't there. We talked about some of the delicacy of GPS and some of the geospatial issues that could come up. Everything's driven off GPS. Do you need redundant Loran-C? Do you need some of these other things that are older technologies? I'm not saying we need Loran-C, but you need to look at what is going to be stable, redundant, going to operate in the Arctic. So, one of the speakers at lunch talked about, the long memories. I ran a fairly large ASW business in the Cold War, and it was a terrific business. It was the number one priority in the nation. Number one. Overnight, disappeared. I had a bunch of acousticians and all these guys. What was I going to do with them? I'm just saying that, those memories, and the nation lost a tremendous amount of brain power as it pertains to ASW and undersea operations in that downturn. It went to off the table. not number 1 or number 2 or number 3. It disappeared. So Washington is a fickle town, and the priorities, and it's very reactionary. So just be sure to know that we have 10,000 years of muscle memory, okay? We know how to do business in the Arctic, and we have the ability to get things done, both here in Washington and in one of the harshest environments on the planet. So as you think about developing these strategies and executing these strategies, please keep us in mind. Look for those win-wins and those partnerships. And by the way, investment through public-private partnerships in developing some of the infrastructure, that's very much on the table and should be exploited. And as long as you can see, you got to be pragmatic about this, as long as you can see a revenue stream and you can see some return on that investment, there can be the dollars raised in multiple ways. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. And thank you, Brian. Thank you, Mike.
Well, thank you, Bill. And if I can, I'll have a few questions, and there may be some from the audience as well. Keying off one of your last points about sort of the changes in national priorities, something that Admiral Z has said for years is how do we raise Arctic interest in the Congress and in the public as a whole? And that was a question raised at lunch. I want to raise it again with this group to say, we're speaking mostly to the choir here. Most everyone here has Arctic experience or knows the issues. How do we go beyond this room to extend further to capture the national imagination or at least the imagination of 535 men and women? Anyone want to take that one?
I'll just tell you, everybody knows how many programs are on television today about Alaska. People, and you look at the number of cruise ships, this is horrifying actually. There are 30 cruise ships under construction earmarked for tours to Alaska. And they are going to penetrate further and further and further north through the Bering Straits and get deeper into Alaska. So, and that's good and bad. It brings attention to the Arctic. It brings attention to that part of the world. But it also, as the Admiral has pointed out, what happens when something goes bad with one of those ships? There is nothing there to support them. Nothing. So it's, I think there's 2 helicopters in Kotzebue, 2 Coast Guard copters. Okay, so if there was a disaster at sea, that'd be a big deal. Now, getting additional attention, I think people love to go. So I think you've got to expose people to it. I think you've got to get various people. Senator Murkowski is very good at getting people to go up to the Arctic. We've got to get more people up there, get exposed to it, understand it a little bit better, because there is nothing that replaces going there. We can talk about it all day long, but if you haven't been there, you have no idea what you're dealing with. So I think getting some excitement about being there, and while you're there, you can absolutely take advantage of that time to expose them to the things that are being done by the various people on these panels and throughout the Arctic.
Bryce?
So I'll share a little story about living in Alaska. When it's really cold out, 30, 40 below, you put your truck in the snowbank, and you don't have a shovel to get yourself out, you have to get really creative and innovative. And so it may be that someone's not going to come down the road for an extended period of time. So I share that story to give an example, I think, of how the Arctic really can be used, and how I see the future forming is really as an interface for communication between departments. One of the things that I do as a mayor in our community is bring people together. And so one of the things I talked about in my introduction was the relationship that we have with our base commanders and really serving their families. And so we take that as an opportunity to connect our bases together, and there's many problems that are solved in our meetings that there's not that cross communication between branches of the military or between different divisions in the local government. And so that's one of the things that I see is really unique about Alaska is when you're in that environment, it requires you to work together. And so I think when we look to the future, that's how Alaska can set the stage for really innovation across the entire nation, is bringing the different branches of military together, the different branches of industry that we have, the different branches of research and development. We have amazing opportunities with our university where we sit down and work on these issues that we have every day, issues in the Arctic, with many different partners. And I think that can be expanded. And as we look to the future, really, it's going to be result-driven and product-driven. So as we can bring people together and start to turn out some of these new concepts and ideas on how we can work together, I think that's really how we're going to set the stage for success.
Yes, Holly.
I think Sean mentioned, the emerging national security threats, and I think that's something that will be very compelling within Congress and perhaps within others within the administration. But another area that might be considered is the economic impact beyond the immediate, beyond Alaska, as the One Belt, One Road effort continues to its logical fruition, as the changes in the economy are moved by China more and more owning the global supply chain. The people who operate ports in Seattle or perhaps even LA Long Beach, places where they might lose some of their work, or where there might be a change in our ability to provide foodstuffs, or to look to the future of how it's going to affect even more broadly the United States. There may be some opportunities, particularly to talk to the private sector about what the impacts might be on those individuals and on those companies.
Bob?
As Admiral Z said, we're very reactive. I've sat through several DoD conferences lately on the Arctic, and I can see a lot of generals and admirals scratching their heads. They know there's an existential threat. The Chinese are a 50-year kind of threat. The Russians are dominating the Arctic, but the Russians like the status quo. They're not trying to upset the boat too much. They harass a little bit around the edges, but nobody's shooting at anybody. And so when people are shooting at people at other places in the world, that takes priority. So somehow we've got it's all about communication, events like this, but maybe to talk about competition and the threat. When the Russians launched a satellite 50-something years ago, that got everybody's attention, and boom, we had a robust space program. We need to repeat often that the Arctic is an important geostrategic place. The Russians and the Chinese are working to dominate that, and so are lots of other, I call them wannabe nations that want to operate in the Arctic. I heard there's 16 of them today. So that's got to be it. We got to somehow broadcast a sense of competition that if we don't do something, we're going to lose out. That's my only guess as a way to push this.
Larry?
It is interesting. If we look or think back, to the 1700s, interest in the Arctic was driven by exploration, and then into the 1900s, it was driven by the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, it was really driven by resource development. So there always has to be some external security or incredibly driving force that has to get behind it to generate the interest and generate the resources that are needed to work up there. And I think actually at this point, what we've been trying to work on is trying to mesh scientific research with industry and business development, and try and get more economic stimulation into the cold regions.
Let me switch tracks here for just a minute, and if you read over the older Arctic strategies and actually some of the newer ones, again and again you see a desire for better information and better prediction, better information about the nautical charts or the what's the current ice extent and thickness, and what's going to happen with atmospheric and ocean if you look at that modeling. And I guess the question would be, how can we, outside of the defense agencies, provide some of that information? What are the tools, corporate lab or academic, that might be able to be brought to bear to improve that understanding of not only where we are, but where we're likely to be in the 20, 30, 40-year horizon? Anybody want to take that one on? Bob, you're...
I just talked about that quite a bit.
Yeah.
We like I said, to us, Alaska's a big laboratory, and we look at all these things. What's happening to the permafrost? What's happening to the ice ice melting, and as the ice melts and recedes, the fetch across the Arctic Ocean gets larger. It's harder for barges to come ashore in places like Reykjavik than it used to be because the winds are stronger, the waves are stronger. There's so much going on. There's lots of opportunities to study this. The way you build in Reykjavik and Barrow is you drill holes, drive pylons down, and let it freeze. It's really cold up there. But in 20 years, it's not going to be cold up there. The way you build around Fairbanks, and even if you looked at my HARP pictures, is you put refrigerators in the ground. The pipeline is refrigerated wherever it's over permafrost. But all that's changing. As the Arctic warms, you may need to start using refrigerators in Barrow to keep the ground frozen. At some point, even that's not going to work. So lots to do, lots to study. It's an incredible laboratory and a lot to learn.
Holly,
And I think we touched on it a little bit with the internal investment we're making in Prepared, that exactly as you mentioned, you need to take all of the parts and pieces and put them together. And I think that's one of the places where we're just now beginning to get enough information that we can start to put together a picture of what some potential outcomes might be. So this scenario-based approach to looking at a combination of events and effects, and then looking at what are the most important drivers in the system, because it's such a complicated system and it's so large. Looking at what really drives the system hard will help you prioritize and also perhaps help you understand where maybe you don't have enough information. It may seem to drive the system or to be insensitive, but it's counterintuitive. So you may need more information to help you focus on that. But getting a little bit away from the gather everything for the sake of gathering everything and really starting to understand through your sensitivities where you need to focus.
Bryce?
You know, I think that's great, but really you have to have the right people in the room at the right time too. So we could have all of this data, and everyone does within their individual silos, but unless we're bringing that data together with the right people, it's going to be pointless. And I think that's one of the challenges that we look at, especially with the Arctic now, is there is a lot of data. We're doing a lot of work in Alaska already. The military has a tremendous amount of assets and data that they're collecting. Is there any way that those can be brought together with an interface to where we can communicate and really identify some of the problems that we don't even know are problems right now? And that's the key I see looking forward, is getting the right people together and communicating effectively.
And hopefully having the right tools to help you have that conversation.
Let me turn now to the audience. We've got a question over on the right here.
Yeah, I've been just looking at the excuse me, broader ecosystem. Climate change has now become a fairly significant issue for the private sector and financial services sectors, insurance, real estate, power, and the like. And there's a pretty substantial emerging segment of private sector companies that are focusing on these issues to a varying degree, collaborating and partnering with the existing research community and the government, the federal government, and other parts of the federal government. And so I would just encourage panelists who are thinking about these issues to think about private-public collaboration and leveraging work that's already underway. And offline, if anyone's interested in more information about at least a dozen private sector companies that are working in this area, I'm happy to discuss it in more detail.
Can I respond?
Larry?
Sure, thank you. And we are doing a lot of that in that, any industry that has got a 30-year, 40-year, 50-year planning horizon in the Arctic needs to consider climate as a component. And so we do a lot of work with the oil industry, with mining industry, and trying to help them understand not just what the design criteria are now, but how they're going to evolve over the years. And there's many aspects of that, including not just the engineering aspects, but also including social considerations, demographics, and other things that really affect the resources available and also the potential workforce.
Yeah, just a very quick follow-up. So to clarify, I was talking about private sector companies that are collaborating with the university community and in turn providing private sector services to those industry segments on a global basis as opposed to just in Alaska. But in any case, thank you very much.
Thank you. Behind the previous speaker and then just in front of the previous speaker.
I asked a question earlier, Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV. I'll make a short statement. I don't know if we can answer it among all your panelists or not, but we look at the intersect between environment and economy all over the globe, and we've been doing a special seminar series on Alaska this year. You have a number of best practices, which is what we're looking for among all these panelists. How do we get all of you together that we can actually do this, because we can broadcast it across the United States and around the globe. But most people don't know about all this is going on, and that's what we're all about. So we'd be more than happy to collaborate with you in any way possible, and we do it as a public service.
It sounds great. We have a real problem, and I've been in Alaska 7 years, and a real problem getting the word out. Right? When people come up and we tell them what we do, they say the same thing. In fact, I've been tempted to write on a piece of paper and stick it in an envelope and hand it to them in the beginning and say, open this envelope at the end. And that envelope, they open it, they'll say, I had no idea. This is a problem we have in Alaska. We're a ways away. It's complex. It's fascinating. But this is a problem we have. And so things like this and any suggestions you have, we're open.
Well, we'll certainly be glad to follow up with all of you and see what we can do on this. We'd love to work with you.
Excellent. Anyone else want to? If not, Jim?
Jim Dotson. Question for anybody, but probably best answered by Marcel. You talked earlier about the LRDR that Lockheed is involved with, and my understanding of that system is that it's going to produce a tremendous amount of information, probably only a small percentage of which will be classified for military use. The lack of infrastructure, the lack of information, the need for interagency cooperation. Is there discussion going on today about how to utilize that information, where to gather it? And if there's not, do you know where that conversation should start?
You know, Jim, I guess I'd start first by saying let's talk after this panel and pull in Rick and Dan, who are the real subject matter experts, because I think they may have some ideas. I just think that the broader point you made about the capability of that radar system, the step change forward that it represents in innovation is an important one, and we need to be ensuring that we really think through how we fully leverage that kind of capability, both in place and clear, but also from the Lockheed perspective as we think about kind of proliferating that capability across other mission needs in other areas and for other government customers. We just think there's a lot of opportunity and a rich discussion to have on that. But maybe we could huddle after this panel with Dan and Rick and others to talk a little bit more about that.
Other questions from the audience? Well, if not, I want to thank all the panelists for your time, particularly those who did this on such short notice. And I'll turn the mic back over to Mike Sbrega.
Thank you all. So we're almost back on time. I knew it would happen. Thank you very much to this extraordinary panel. Sam, we can talk later about ways in which we can connect panel expertise to the Emerald Planet as well. So we have a coffee break now brought to us by our friends at Geo North. I want to thank them for that. We'll take a 15-minute break, start again at 3:15. We'll be right back on schedule. Thank you.